to the History Bards Historical Movie Reviews. It's movie time starting in 4, 3, 2, 1. With your hosts, Michael Zucker and Dee Marley.
Everyone, and welcome to the History Bards podcast. This is your co-host, Michael Zucker, author of the Eisenhower Chronicles. With me is my co-host,
Dee Marley.
We have another classic historical fiction film to review for you today. Today, we're going to discuss the Woody Allen's 2011 film, Midnight in Paris. This has one of the most interesting premises of any historical fiction film, certainly of the ones that we've reviewed so far. Dee, do you want to give your initial thoughts on the film?
Yeah, definitely. So, I'm not a huge fan of Woody Allen movies, but this is definitely up there with some of my favorites. I think it was just, during the pandemic, and I was trying to find movies to watch, and I came across this one, and I like Owen Wilson anyway. So it was like, oh, I wonder what this is about. And then when I read like the blurb about it, and I was like, oh yes, I'm definitely watching this. But yeah, one of my favorites, and I just was yeah, the premise behind it about, because you have the whole time travel, going on in there, and a lot of historical fans really love time travel. And I think the whole idea of looking for something better, the whole theme, how each generation of people were all like, I loved the idea of, oh, I wish I lived back then because it was so much better. And that's kind of what he was doing. He wished that he lived back in the 20s whenever Hemingway and Fitzgerald were living in Paris, and there was that whole writer's scene, and he felt like that he could really connect. He wanted to connect because of his own insecurities about being a writer. So I think we can all relate to that. But then it was so interesting how that whenever he got there, and then the girl that he meets, she just thought that living in the Belle Epoque era of Paris was it. That's what she wanted. So it's curious how we do that, throughout each generation. We're like, oh, I wish I lived back then. And yet it really wasn't any different. When you're there, it's not as magical, I guess, as you think it's going to be.
Well, that's one question I wanted to ask. I guess I don't know about living, but if there was any historical period that you could visit, what would your pick be?
Ooh, that's really hard because, I'm a huge Tudor fan. I love that whole era when Shakespeare lived. But when you really think about it, I don't, unless I was, I don't know, even if you're a noble living in that era, it wasn't the ideal, like, scenario that people think, because you have all these movies about the Tudor era, but then you think about wearing the clothing they had to wear, and they didn't have air conditioning, or anything like that, or heat during the winter. So it was brutal. It had to have been really brutal to live. And then I think I've even thought about that living here in the South, about, living back during the Civil War era, or like pre-Civil War. Oh, I can't even imagine what those women had to endure wearing the clothes that they did. So I don't know. I think that's what the movie kind of portrayed, is that you have an idea of what you think it's going to be like, probably based on the books that you read and the movies that you see. And in reality, it's not like that at all. And so I think the movie really, really was able to capture that. You know, what was that? I'm trying to remember. Oh, so like I just recently watched the last Downton Abbey movie again, and she makes a comment in it about never meet your favorite actors because they're going to disappoint you, because they were doing a whole movie they were doing a movie within a movie in that movie. And I was thinking about that whenever his character, Owen Wilson's character, meets Hemingway and Fitzgerald. And, it's not quite what he envisioned before. And yet, to us, like whenever I was watching the movie and the actors that played them, they were exactly how as I imagined Hemingway and Fitzgerald being. So,
Well, I think one thing that I noticed, I think both this time and the previous time that I watched this film, is that I see the historical characters almost more like caricatures
yeah, they were. They
of
were.
who they probably were, more like what Hemingway is within the public imagination, more than like the
Yeah.
actual person, which I'm sure that was surely intentional
It was.
on Woody Allen's part, that he wasn't like, this is Hemingway. It's like it's almost more like a cartoonish version
Yeah.
of him.
Yeah.
Just want to say that with this film, that I feel like this film is a important one for me, because I saw it first in theaters when it came out in 2011.
Mhm.
I was 16 at the time, which I guess is kind of telling people my age, but whatever. So I had started writing at that point. I started writing like very, in kind of a broad sense when I was around 7, but then took it more seriously as a teenager,
Mhm.
and was writing A Great Soldier, The Last Great War at that point. But I didn't know any other writers and wasn't seeking out, or didn't really know to go to who for advice or anything. And so for this film, which is so much about being a writer and meeting, Hemingway and Fitzgerald,
Yeah.
it just connected with me at that time. Particularly the scene where Owen Wilson's character first meets Hemingway,
Yeah.
and Hemingway's talking about being a writer and the competitiveness of it, and that
Yeah.
Owen Wilson asked him to read his novel about the nostalgia shop, and Hemingway just immediately says, "I hate it. If it's bad, I'll hate it because I hate bad writing. If it's good, I'll be envious and hate it even more."
Yeah.
And just the entire mentality was introduced to me then, and it just meant a lot to me at that point, and it has ever since. And this is the film that sort of introduced me to Hemingway in particular, who probably is still my favorite writer.
Yeah.
That after watching this film, I read The Sun Also Rises, which I don't think I fully understood at that time. I think now I would rank it as one of my favorite novels of his. I read all of Hemingway's major novels, my favorite of which what became For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is still one of my 5 favorite novels.
Right.
And then from there, just the rest of sort of classic American literature, both Fitzgerald, Mark Twain, Moby Dick, Cormac McCarthy's works. Just from there, like this film was sort of the introduction to me to not just the type of science fiction or kind of more recent historical fiction that I was reading at that time, but just all of sort of classic, the American canon.
Yeah.
This film was sort of the trigger for me for that.
Yeah.
And so, I'm sort of in debt to it in that way, that it introduced me to, my favorite writer and so many others.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
That, nobody has as large of an influence on how, especially prose in particular.
Yeah.
On my prose than Hemingway does. And I know he probably had the biggest impact on English language prose of any writer of the 20th century. And I think it's great that this film sort of both recognizes that and also was able to introduce him both to me and I'm sure to many other people.
Yeah. And then the way that Fitzgerald and Zelda are portrayed, I really, really enjoyed that, because they were so iconic for that time period. And I think we mentioned that before when we did when we reviewed Great Gatsby. Yeah. And I talked about that movie Zelda, or Z, I think it's called Z, about how much that really showed that side of her that a lot of people don't know about, about F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife. But I think she had like a huge influence on him and his writing, and I don't know, they were like the representatives of the 20s, and I think that's kind of like referred to in the movie. I can't remember exactly when, but I think he says something about similar to that.
Well, one thing, I mean, we probably mentioned this in the Great Gatsby review, but one thing that I just find is interesting is that that novel essentially flopped when it first came out.
Yeah.
But since World War, I mean, I'm sure we talked about this, that in the lead up to D-Day, that Eisenhower's headquarters, just kind of by coincidence, gave that novel to so many of the soldiers that's what launched it into global fame. That even though it flopped when it first came out, it now sort of defines America's memory of what the 20s were.
Yeah, you're right.
And I just think that's, very special and kind of shows what a great novel can do.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, we mentioned Moby Dick, another novel that sort of, flopped when it first came out, and now is usually thought of as the great American epic, and
yeah,
defines our memory certainly of the whaling industry, but also just of so much of American sort of quote mythology.
Yeah, the greatest first line ever. That's always the first line that everybody goes to. And like, what's the greatest first line in a historical novel ever? And it's always "Call me Ishmael."
Call me Ishmael. We're getting really off track here.
I know.
But I think one thing I think is interesting about that line is that it's he's not saying my name is Ishmael, it's call me Ishmael, as though it's an alias.
Yeah.
And I'll speak one last. I'm currently rereading Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, and you can just tell that the opening line is inspired by Call Me Ishmael, because it's see the kid, or no, see the child, which is it's also like it's three words, and it's sort of like an order to the reader that just sort of launches everything. And so I think I mean, I know McCarthy said that Moby Dick was his favorite novel, and you could just kind of see the influence.
Well, he probably did that. Yeah, that's a pretty brilliant line too. I like that.
Those are, I mean, those are both sort of, every writer probably dreams of opening a novel with
just
that
3 words. Yeah.
3 words. That's just like a perfect 3 words.
Yeah, perfect 3 words. That's a good challenge. We should do that sometime. Like, give a challenge to the writers in the historical fiction group on Facebook. I'm going to do that. So stay tuned. I'm going to do that.
You've been warned, and sorry everybody for when that comes. Sorry for my complicity.
Well, back to the movie. So I love this movie. I love everything about this movie. It's just it's fun. There's there is like an underlying theme about trying to find your place, but it's fun. I really like.
Well, I think one thing that's interesting that I picked I think it was this time that I watched it, which is that the entire lesson of, don't get caught up in nostalgia or golden age thinking.
Yeah.
That's sort of the main antagonist of the film. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them, but like one of the main ones is, I think his name is Paul, who's sort of, I guess he's a professor.
And he thinks he knows everything.
But what's implied by the end is that he's essentially right about the main theme, which is that Owen Wilson's character is too caught up in nostalgia.
Yeah.
And that, golden age thinking, again, my favorite American president is Dwight Eisenhower, and sort of, that he's able to kind of make the most dangerous decade possibly in world history the sort of stable, kind of peaceful era.
Yeah.
But not looking back with like, oh, it was just perfect back then.
Right.
There may have been positive elements, but like it was certainly not, a perfect age.
Yeah.
And not necessarily wanting to trade, if it's sort of an all or nothing trade, our era for that era, that's sort of being wary of that type of mentality.
Yeah, I think that's what I was saying earlier about when you asked me about the Tudor age, I'm like, yeah, I'm sure there was like, that would be interesting, to be able to sit and talk to people like that. But to live in that era, I don't think the reality of it is something that any of us could even imagine what it was really like. Sure, there's like, but and that has to do with Hollywood's kind of glamorizing those kind of things whenever they come out with movies, and you have this idea of, oh, it must have been like that for real, and no, it's not.
Yeah. as those of us who write historical fiction have to research these periods know too well.
Exactly.
Um, Let me ask this. So, I mean, you say you love everything about this film. I think there's a couple of things that certainly don't ruin it, but I feel like are on the weaker side of it.
Okay.
That I'd like to raise. So one of them
Sure.
is, what do you think of sort of quote like the antagonist? So Paul, I think his fiance, Owen Wilson's fiance Inez, her parents. So like, what do you think of them like as characters?
So I think they fit like almost like that same kind of caricature kind of demeanor of like it's almost like Woody Allen was trying to say there are certain people that are like this and there are certain people like this. So let me just embody them in one character. And because like her parents definitely had that kind of stereotypical, I don't like anything. I don't even know why I'm here. I'm an American and I don't even know why I'm in Paris to begin with. And then she was so his fiance was just I don't know, kind of embodied that too, but like the shallowness of her and that it all had to be about her. So I think she embodied that. And then Paul just kind of represented all of the know-it-alls.
Yeah. I guess to me it's just like all the antagonists are have this type of very obnoxious attitude.
Yeah. Yes,
And
definitely.
I don't know, I guess it's not like a flaw or anything like that. It's just like there's like just no nuance between sort of, Owen Wilson's trying to be like this nice kind of romantic
Yeah.
feeling guy versus these people who are just like are so terrible
Yes, exactly.
that it's a question of like, first of all, I guess it's not unfair to say like are people actually like this, given that like there are plenty of people who are like that. But just, to Owen Wilson's kind of like, why are you even like with this family?
Yeah,
It's like
exactly.
they clearly have like just no overlapping values almost at all.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Um,
And maybe that played into the whole reason for him living in that dream world of nostalgia and
yeah,
everything, because he was so surrounded by all of that, and it was an escape. And when you think about it, the whole scenario of him going and sitting on the steps and at midnight and the car coming by, that was all an escape. It was his own take on escaping that reality of having to deal with them.
yeah. I think one of my favorite aspects of this film is that it doesn't give any real explanation of how he's going back in time. That
No,
it's sort of like Woody Allen's just like it doesn't matter.
it
Just
doesn't
it's
matter.
just it's kind of like it's the fantasy. Just go with
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
I think that he didn't try to like build some sort of convoluted explanation of how this
yeah,
works. Like it's fun. Just go with it.
yeah. Which is interesting because lots of times I think historical fiction authors who write time travel, I know I did it because like in my book Kingfisher, I felt like I needed to try to explain why this was happening. And so and and I hope it worked, but that's really interesting how Woody Allen did that. There was no explanation. It just happens
Yeah,
and yet it worked. It really did work.
yeah. I'll mention that when I was in college, I wrote a play where President George W. Bush is trying to decide what to do with some of the foreign policy decisions, and he meets the spirits of other presidents, and they have a sort of debate about them. And
Uh-huh.
I feel like probably consciously use this type of mechanism of like just don't even bother trying to explain how this
Yeah.
works. Just it's
Yeah.
just an interesting premise and just kind of go with it.
Yeah. That's really curious. I wonder if I'm sure there is. There's probably historical time travel books out there that use that premise, but for right now, I don't know of any. It's almost like you have to have some kind of um like object or something in your DNA. That's what I use, that it
Right.
was in their DNA. And
Mhm.
so yeah, that's really interesting how he was able to pull that off because I didn't question it. I didn't really. I mean, the first time it happened, I was like, how did it's the car. Maybe it was the car that was the time travel machine.
Which I should have written down the specifics, but there was, I guess it's somebody noted that that car first came into use in 1929. But by that time, Hemingway and most of the other writers had already left Paris.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's extremely nitpicky as a critique.
It is.
Just, there was another one, which again, this is so nitpicky, just ignore it. But that Hemingway said, or so when Owen Wilson expresses how much he likes Hemingway, Hemingway says, "You like my book," which presumably is in reference to The Sun Also Rises, which was Hemingway's first major novel. He'd written a couple of short books of poetry and short stories before that, but presumably it's referring to The Sun Also Rises, which came out in 1926. By which time he'd already started his falling out with Gertrude Stein.
Yeah.
So the fact that he clearly still has his relationship with her, the continuity of that doesn't quite work out, but again,
it's like one of those things that sometimes we have to do as historical fiction authors. We're like, well, that time date doesn't really coincide, so can I fudge it just a little bit? So that's
right.
What he did.
These are the type of liberties that, like, I personally think is fair to make a work of historical fiction. I mean, historical fiction is ultimately a work of art, and
right,
you know, it needs to be able to function.
Yeah, exactly.
And
then Adrian Brody's like portrayal of Salvador Dali, that was great.
Yeah. That was great. I think one person he's mentioned early in the film, but who I would have loved to have seen shown up was James Joyce.
Oh yeah.
Because there's funny stories of Joyce and Hemingway in, going out drinking together, and Joyce kind of starting or upsetting somebody else to the point where it's going to start a fight. And then Joyce would run behind Hemingway and be like, "Get them, Hemingway."
Oh, that would have been great. That would have been a great
it's like that would have been a great, moment to have. And it's not because he was he's mentioned at the start of the film, but he doesn't appear. I mean, T.S. Eliot is very brief. He like shows up for a second. There's
and Toulouse-Lautrec. You have that Toulouse-Lautrec when they go back to the Belle Époque era. So that's he was in there. I can't remember who else was portrayed. I think maybe that was it.
Picasso's there.
Picasso, yes, of course, Picasso. I remember.
Picasso's there. I don't know. I think we were talking about not like flaws, but just like preferences, I guess. That I feel like the second half of the film loses kind of some of the, I don't know if it's the momentum, but like the first half is where you meet Fitzgerald and Hemingway, and they don't really appear in the second half. And so it's like it just loses kind of like some of the magic with that, and it focuses more on Owen Wilson's character arc. And his relationship with the French woman he meets in the 1920s, Adriana.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like, it's a little sad that you don't get Hemingway just being a riot the entire second half. I mean, at a certain point, you're just kind of asking for it to be more of a biographical film of Hemingway. But
I know, exactly.
I don't know. To me, it's like he kind of like is the one who just kind of steals the show, especially
he does
when they first meet.
I really love. I can't remember who the actor is that played him, but he did a great job.
It's Corey. I forget his last name. I think his first name is Corey though, which just doesn't really help.
And of course, Tom Hiddleston. Everybody loves Tom Hiddleston.
Yeah, since he played Loki in the Avengers films. Although I think the guy who plays Hemingway plays the villain in the first Ant-Man film, so I don't know if that helps. Oh, I want to mention one of my favorite lines in this film is where Zelda is contemplating suicide,
jumping in the scene.
Right, but so Owen Wilson's character and Adriana stop her, and he gives her a pill, and they're just like, "What is this?" And he says it's Valium. He just thinks like it's the pill of the future.
Yeah. Yeah. That was funny. Yeah, it's overall, I really enjoyed this movie. It's like it's a movie that you can just, it's not extremely deep, but it's just fun, and it's something that I could just watch over and over again, just whenever I want a little bit of levity and enjoyment, and has something to do with history. I think this is a good movie to go to.
Right. It's not trying to be, maybe Lawrence of Arabia or something like
No,
of
it's not.
that scale, but
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very sort of, fun, sort of light type of historical fiction film that has a very interesting premise that I think it executes very well. And I think it's a great introduction to a generation of some of the greatest artists in the last couple centuries.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there anything else we want to touch on? Do we want to start to wrap up?
No, I'm good. I think it's a good overall review of it.
Do we want to give scores?
Yeah, so I know you said that I always give 10, but it's like we're starting out with movies to review that we really like, so I'm going to give it a 10.
I think we might treat scores a little differently. I think to me, like, give me something at 10, it kind of implies it's like, on the short list of the all-time greatest films.
Well, okay, that's true. So let's say, if you're saying it like that, then okay, I'm going to give it an 8.
Yeah, and that's the score that I would give this.
Okay.
That I think it's certainly an above average film. It's probably even a great film. I don't know if I would quite put it in the same league as, I guess you didn't like Bridge on the River Kwai, which I gave a 9. I gave a 9 to last week, but so I think 8, sort of approaching 9 territory, is kind of where I would place this.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, so we're giving it an overall 8 out of 10 stars.
So do we want to mention what we're going to review for next week?
Yes.
So people can watch it if they want?
Yes, definitely.
So I think we agreed on Beckett.
Yes, we're going to watch Beckett. Beckett with Peter O'Toole and wow, his name just went right out of my head. How dare me forget? Richard Burton. How could I forget? Okay, it's Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton, and Peter O'Toole plays Henry, and Richard Burton plays Beckett, and it's that's what we're going to be doing next week.
To earn the wrath of all our listeners, I'll just mention this is my first time seeing this film, so you'll get my sort of fresh perspective. I won't have this sort of history with it as I do with either Midnight in Paris or Lawrence or any of the other films that we've seen so far, or that we've reviewed so far.
This is this will probably be my 10th time watching it. So
are we ready for the sign off?
Sure.
So thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's review. We'll see you next week with a review of another classic historical fiction film, Beckett. So go ahead and watch that to either refresh your memory or to watch it for the first time like me. So keep making history and keep listening.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the History Bards historical movie reviews. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and follow us at our YouTube channel at the Historical Fiction Company or on Spotify.